Okay, thank you for coming back. I'm sorry I speak for too long. I should have finished in 1 hour the talk, but I'm sorry. So this is only a few more pages to go. So, and in this part, I will speak about everyday and ritual, and I will look at the archaeological evidence from Anglo-Saxon England for how one can find belief and ritual in the archaeological evidence. So earlier in the presentation, I mentioned that near Bradbourne is the Bronze Age tumulus of Wigburlow, and that into the tumulus was inserted in the 7th century a series of burials. These are burials of Anglian people, probably chiefs, but the crucial point here is that this act, this insertion of Anglian burials into Bronze Age monuments, is something that we know from across Anglo-Saxon England. This is one example of many, many, many instances in which early medieval burials were placed in Bronze Age monuments. This is another example from Yorkshire, where you have a Bronze Age barrow with a stone grave in the middle, and then all around you have the bodies of Anglo-Saxons inserted into the barrow. Now, it's argued, it's accepted by archaeologists that this phenomenon of inserting burials into the Bronze Age barrows represented an attempt by the Anglo-Saxon elites to contact the world of the ancestors. They were trying to get back to the world of the ancestors. Now, as the cross at Bradbourne would become a century later, this mound, this tumulus, is an eruption of the supernatural into the world of the everyday, into the world of the living in the 7th century. In fact, it's possible that in the time of the cross, so this monument is 7th century. There's 7th century burials. The cross is the 8th century. But it's possible that in the 8th and 9th centuries, this burial mound also carried supernatural qualities. So even when the area was Christianized, it's possible that the barrow had supernatural qualities. But this time, diabolical qualities, qualities of the devil rather than of good. Because we know from studies in other parts of Anglo-Saxon England, and also from Beowulf, we know that demons or dragons or diabolical creatures were thought to inhabit these ancient burial mounds. We also know that from the 9th century and into the 10th century, these burial mounds, which had been very beneficial objects in the 7th century, we know that in the 9th and 10th centuries, they became execution sites. We know that they were places where people were hanged and the bodies were buried. And the idea is that you associate the dead, the criminal dead, with the devils. And so there are many examples of this from Anglo-Saxon England. We have a Bronze Age barrow reused in the 7th century to get close to the ancestors, but then with Christianity, the barrow has diabolical associations, is used for execution, and the criminals are buried next to the devils in the mound. This is an example of such a barrow from Bedfordshire in Anglo-Saxon England, where you have an execution cemetery with the bodies of the executed dead buried around the monument. Coming back to the main point, however, it's now an accepted theme of early medieval archaeology in England that the ritual life of the Anglo-Saxons involved practices that reached back in time to the world of the ancestors, to the world of the people they thought were their ancestors. It's now accepted that ritual was structured through a relationship with the past. So we know that Anglo-Saxon rituals involved some kind of reaching back into the past. Until very recently, however, this ritual life of the Anglo-Saxons was very sharply divided from the imagined routines of the everyday. The everyday when people talked about the everyday, they talked about subsistence, they talked about exchange. They didn't talk about these ritual practices that I just tried to describe. Very little consideration was given to the possibility that everyday life was everyday. The life of people every day was structured in a relationship with the past through the world of the ancestors. Now that's changing. I'll show you how it's changing in a second. And one of my students in Sheffield, Vicky Crew, is looking at the impact of prehistoric monuments on early medieval settlement patterns in parts of England. So I'm going to show you some of this work today. So again, it's not my work, it's my student's work, but anyway, she's smarter than me. This idea that the settlements were structured through the prehistoric past was introduced into archaeology in England in 1987 by Professor Richard Bradley. You may know Richard Bradley. He's a prehistorian. He studies rock art. He doesn't do medieval archaeology at all, but he re-looked at the archaeology of one of the best-known sites of Anglo-Saxon England and rethought it. This is the site of Yevering in Northumbria. It was first discovered in aerial photography in 1946, and if you can see, there's a huge enclosure here with some palaces coming off here, some other buildings there, and a series of structures down here. This is a 7th century palace of the Northumbrian kings, King Edwin, King Ethelwulf. So we know the name of the site, we know what it's associated with. So Richard Bradley re-looked at this archaeology, and he also re-looked at the archaeology of the surrounding area, the landscape archaeology of the surrounding area. And what he showed was that at Yevering, at this site itself, the organization of the settlement, the way the settlement was structured, and this is a reconstruction of what the settlement looked like with the long houses here. There's a partial theatre complex here and some other buildings back there, but the main hall was here. But what he showed was that the main organization of the settlement was determined by a post, this post here, driven into a Bronze Age barrow. So there's a Bronze Age barrow here, this post was driven into it, and this post formed the line, which was the organizing line for the structure of the settlement. So it ran like this. Now we know that line was there because the other feature that he found was a burial situated just here, just outside the entrance to the main palace. So the line goes, I'll show you this better in a second. The line goes like this. This burial, which is here, was situated just here. And there was another post. This post AX here was situated there. So the two posts and the burial formed the organization of the settlement. So literally, the settlement was tied to the Bronze Age. It was tied into the Bronze Age past by this post. Also significant is that this burial contained an individual. The individual was buried with a very strange object. This object was made of wood and bronze, and it's been interpreted as a groma. And a groma is an instrument used by Roman land surveyors for setting out alignments and setting out right angles. So you have a surveying instrument, possible surveying instrument, buried with an individual at a point which is creating the most significant line around which the settlement is structured. The significant point, again, being that this line is tied to the Bronze Age, tied into, they didn't know it was the Bronze Age, but it's tied into the past, into the world of the ancestors. So this settlement is structured by its relationship with the ancestral past. The other significant thing, as a slight aside, is that the head of this groma is probably in the shape of a goat. And Jevering in Old English is Adgefrin, and Adgefrin means the hill of the goats. So there's kind of lots of different connections you can make, but the most significant one is between alignment, surveying, and a relationship with the prehistoric past. The area around the palace at Jevering, sorry, okay, so this is the excavator, Brian Hope Taylor's interpretation of how the settlement was laid out, with the barrow there, the burial there, and this line running right through the middle, through the midpoint of the theatre-like complex and out the other side. So and then you have a series of alignments coming off that using the theatre itself. So it's very highly structured, but ultimately pinned to that point on the Bronze Age barrow. The surrounding area, and Adgefrin is here, and in the valley around it, there are 8 Neolithic henges, 8 henge monuments of the early Neolithic, running up the valley. At some point in the 7th century, these monuments were linked together by a double line of earthworks. So someone in the 7th century was building earthworks on top of and linking together these prehistoric monuments. These prehistoric monuments also contained early medieval burials. So people were burying their dead preferentially into the prehistoric monuments. Richard Bradley argued that this double line of earthworks linking together the henges ended up in front of another Anglo-Saxon royal palace at a place called Melmin, or Millfield. And he says, this should come up now, he says, it seems possible that this earthworks functioned as a formal approach to this complex, not unlike some of the earthworks recorded on Irish royal sites. This association between henges and post-Roman royal sites is strengthened by the discovery that 2 of the monuments close to Millfield had been reused for inhumation cemeteries at that time. So again, it's very simply an appropriation of the prehistoric past into the early medieval present on the scale of landscape. Not just on one site, but right across the whole landscape. Now, Bradley published that paper in 1987, but very few archaeologists picked up the idea that settlements, the everyday settlements of individuals, could be or were determined by their relationship with the prehistoric past. In other words, by their relationship with the ancestors. That there was a ritual element in the everyday life of people. Most people, when they thought about this, thought about it in terms of burials. They understood that people would bury their dead in prehistoric monuments, but they didn't understand that prehistoric monuments were structuring the lives, the everyday life of people. Now, in some ways, it's hard to understand why that is the case, because Brian Hope Taylor, who excavated this site, he made that relationship very clear. And you've seen that this image before. Hope Taylor made it very clear that he believed that the whole settlement was structured around the relationship between this post, this individual here, that post, and the theatre-like complex there. So it was very clear in the excavation report that there was a relationship between ritual and settlement, but that was kind of ignored largely by archaeologists. It was ignored, I think, because people believed this was an elite site, it was a palatial site. They believed that only elites who were concerned with ancestry and with origins would structure their daily lives in relationship to antiquity and the dead. But it's also probably just a product of the fact that people didn't consider the role of ritual in everyday life. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is look at some other examples from Anglo-Saxon England of how the everyday life of individuals was structured in and through ritual practice. Because it's becoming increasingly clear that what was going on in Anglo-Saxon England was marvelous, was miraculous, really, that the supernatural did intrude in everyday life almost everywhere. This is probably clearest in a recent paper by Professor Helena Hamerow from the University of Oxford. And she's published a brilliant paper in the 2006 edition of the journal Medieval Archaeology. And the paper is called Special Deposits in Archaeology. Now, she has revealed in this paper the existence of what she calls special deposits. Now, these special deposits, she says, are animal or human remains deposited within settlements, in pits, ditches, buildings, but also in graves. So they're animal or human deposits deposited within settlements where deliberate or careful placement seems likely. So these are deliberate deposits within settlements that she's talking about. In many cases, her studies of early Anglo-Saxon settlement revealed that these special deposits were found in the upper fills of sunken featured buildings, or Grubenhäuser. You also have them in Italy, but in England she's pointed out that in the upper fills of Grubenhäuser you very often find these special deposits. That's the, sorry. So the Grubenhäuser is there. There's one from a site, the famous site at West Stow, and at West Stow there are bones of dogs buried at significant points, both at the base and in the upper layers of the sequence. At Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire, another example, the two back legs of a dog were found in the eastern post hole of the Grubenhaus, and the two front legs were found in the western post hole of the Grubenhaus. Now, she says that these deposits, and I quote, they could reasonably be interpreted as the remains of rites associated with the termination of the use of the buildings in which they were placed. She noted that in almost every case, the deposits are found at the termination, at the end, when the building is abandoned. In the upper levels of the fill, you find these strange special deposits. She goes on to argue, and this is the quote here, that if these buildings were used for grain storage, and that's an if, there are many other uses proposed for these buildings, she says if they were used for grain storage, the concentration of special deposits in these structures could point to a fertility ideology in which such structures were a means of offering thanks to chthonic powers and calling on them to protect the stored grain and ensure future fertility. Quite rightly, she says, this is no more than an intriguing possibility, although it's one strengthened by the association between infant burials and other special deposits and grain processing and storage facilities in both Iron Age and Roman Britain. So quite often you find children buried within grain processing activities in 4th century Britain. That's something I'll come back to in a second, the burial of children within these settlements. So she talks a lot about these special features and notes that they almost always occur in the final levels of the Grubenhaus. She then goes on to make a whole series of connections, a whole series of arguments about the relationship between special deposits and entrances and boundaries. So she took the total archaeology and looked at where you find these special deposits in settlements in Anglo-Saxon England. You'll remember that the burial at Yevering that I talked about a second ago, the burial, this is the Bronze Age post here, the burial, this is the palace here, and the burial was just outside the door, the main doorway into that building. So a direct association between burials and entrances that she has there. She took that and she generalized from it. She generalized from and looked at other settlements. And the one settlement she looked at in detail, about very briefly, is the settlement of Catholm. It's in Staffordshire in central England. And this is the plan of the settlement, with the boundary running around here, the main trackway through the structure here, and a whole series of enclosures within the building. She looked at where you find these special deposits. And she says, oops, wrong one. She says, at the settlement of Catholm in Staffordshire, all three special deposits, marked in red on the screen, all three special deposits, one human, two human and one bovine, they were placed near the entrances to ditched enclosures which appeared to have defined properties. Burial 3666 lay north of the entrance. The other burial was dug into the infill of a sunken feature building, and the other burial was located next to a major trackway that ran right the way through the building. Now that association, she argues, between entrances and boundaries and burial almost certainly stems from a desire through ritual practice to reinforce the liminal and transitional nature of these locations. So they're on the boundaries, they're on the end. These areas have to be protected, and that's the reason, she says, that they put these special deposits, these burials there. What these deposits are doing, she says, or she argues, is to create points in the settlement in which the supernatural breaks through, in which the supernatural protects, in which the supernatural structures everyday life. Now, that association between special deposits and boundaries and entrances is also found in other parts of the Germanic world. And there is, in other parts of the Germanic world, a much stronger emphasis on infant burial inside settlements. So in England, infant burials tend to be placed in these kind of liminal areas around the edges of the settlement. So children, dead children, being used to protect the edges of the settlement. The situation is a bit different in continental Europe, especially in Germany and in parts of Denmark, where children, infants, are much more intimately associated with houses. So at the very famous northern German settlement of Feddersenwerde, as on the north coast of Germany, reconstruction here, you tend to find animals, dogs and horses especially, but also humans. Dogs were associated with the boundaries of the settlement and also with entrances into the settlements, but infants and children were deposited close to houses. And the reality of that, of what they're doing, becomes clear from a settlement called Hessen in Lower Saxony, where a child was buried beneath a hearth. So beneath the hearth of the house, they buried a child, having stabbed it and strangled it. So this wasn't just a child who had died that they buried under the hearth. They killed the child and then buried it under the hearth to protect the house. So in this case, again, as in the other cases, the everyday life of people is being structured through ritual practices, through the creation of points which link the supernatural with the everyday. I want to finish this consideration of the role of the ritual in everyday life in Anglo-Saxon England by going back briefly to Catholm, the settlement that I talked about a minute ago. Professor Helena Hamerow, highlights the ritual significance of deposits in areas on the edge of this settlement. These are protective deposits, she says. However, there may be evidence here that the everyday was structured also through a relationship with the past, with the ancestors. She doesn't pick this up, which is strange, because the paper by Bradley is probably the most famous paper in British archaeology at the moment. The idea that the past structures the present, the idea that the ritual monuments of the past are very significant in organizing the present. So this again is the excavations at Catholm. She discusses burials around the edges of the settlement, but also in a sunken featured building up here. But what she didn't talk about is the fact that in this area here, there are 3 prehistoric monuments, all from the Bronze Age. And it's clear from the excavator, from the excavation report, that these monuments were visible in the Anglo-Saxon period. And it's also significant that these monuments, that there are no Anglo-Saxon structures built in this zone. So the Anglo-Saxon world does not intrude into this zone at all. It's also significant that this special prehistoric zone of the settlement is situated right next to the main entrance into the settlement, which runs through there. But one could argue that just as at Yevering, the structure of the settlement is laid out in terms of the prehistoric past, one could argue that exactly the same is happening there. In fact, the excavator says of that particular area, he says that the area of the monuments was demarcated and was respected by the occupants of the Anglo-Saxon settlement. So again, my student Vicky Crew is working on looking at how common that particular feature is, the presence of prehistoric monuments inside and structuring early medieval settlements is. She's looking at how common that is across Anglo-Saxon England. I want to finish by looking across the Atlantic to North America, because this gives a very good instance of what can happen if we don't think about the archaeology of the reality of ritual in everyday life. Professor Mark Leone is a fantastic archaeologist working on Annapolis in Maryland. And in 1990, his excavation at this house, the Carroll in Annapolis, Maryland, uncovered what they thought were just a very mundane set of objects. The base of a pot, some rock crystals, some pins, some coins that had holes pierced in them, some other pieces of rock crystal. So they found these, and they thought this was rubbish. At first, when they looked at what they'd found, they just dismissed it as trash, as rubbish, as everyday activities. They then spoke to Native American communities not Native American, Black American communities in North America, and they worked closely with texts, but also with oral traditions, and they found out that what they had here was, in fact, was part of a set of ritual activities. These objects were deposited in a ritual form in an attempt to control the spirit world, a spirit world which was either attacking or could provide good fortune for others. What he concludes about these objects that he found in the Carroll house, sorry, I thought I had a quote there. He says that these objects constituted efforts to control the passage of potentially harmful or helpful spirits, and these spirits used chimneys, doors, pipes, stairs, and the northeast corner of houses to gain access, to gain entrance to people whom they were trying to harm. So the objects were placed in particular points in the house to try and protect those points against these evil spirits. So again, note in this case the use of objects in liminal parts of the house, in weak areas of the house to try and protect it from the evil spirits. Now, the significance of that discovery for us is that removed from this context, the context provided by texts, the context provided by oral traditions, removed from that context, these objects were seen as yard scatter, rubbish, trash, household discard. They were dismissed as mundane. They were dismissed as routine. They were dismissed as the waste of everyday life. But in fact, what he showed was that in the 18th century in North America, these objects were deeply meaningful. And they were, in fact, vehicles through which the supernatural penetrated and influenced the everyday. They protected the everyday. Just like the cross, just like the barrows around Bradbourne, these were points of interaction, intersection between the marvelous, between the miraculous and the mundane. And the lesson for us really is that unless we kind of think about these kind of things, we're in danger of overlooking that which is in fact marvelous and miraculous. We're in danger of overlooking that as mundane or as rubbish. And in fact, Helena Hamerow makes exactly the same point in her paper. She says that much of the evidence that she's considered from these sunken featured buildings of Anglo-Saxon England has been in the past considered rubbish and not worthy of study. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for so long.
I don't remember well the quotation, but once Moses Finley wrote that the worst thing that we can do against our ancestors is that to pretend they arose the same questions and wars, that they answer the same way. So my question is, do you really think we have the proper tools to investigate, or do you think that this must be a sort of multidisciplinary project? Because other subjects, other scholars can have proper tools. This sort of studies is against, or is a new approach, as a threshold between normal landscape studies and this new way of approaching. Because we know, we always think about landscapes looking at our maps, which are vertical maps, and people used to perceive landscapes from below, not from above. So our perception of central places is probably distorted. But my question, my deep question is, do you think that this kind of studies is in some way to relate with normal and traditional ones, or do you think that this is really a threshold?
Thank you. That's in many ways the obvious question, but it is one of the reasons I was very keen to talk about this, because if I forget about landscape, remind me to talk about landscape, because I think it's very important. Is this a new approach? Is it do we need multidisciplinary approaches? I don't think it's a new approach, really. I think that in some disciplines they've been talking about this a lot. In archaeology, they've been talking about this a lot, but primarily in Britain in prehistory. And so prehistorians talk about these kind of things. Prehistorians, when they excavate a domestic site, they will look for ritual in the domestic site. When we excavate a domestic site, we look for subsistence, we look for house structures, we look for a sequence. We don't look for ritual. And it's quite difficult to know why that is, why we think that we are not capable of finding ritual as prehistorians do. Now, some people would argue that prehistorians talk about ritual because they don't have evidence for anything else, because they don't have the texts or the art history which will allow them to talk about ritual. Maybe that's true, but the point I would make is that, and the question you raised, is that to do what I've said, to do what I've suggested, is it must be multidisciplinary. Because archaeologists have their speciality, but I cannot understand the art history. The art history of this cross is fantastic. Fantastic. How different people would have seen the images in different ways. One example, I'll come back to landscape. At the top of the cross are angels. Angels, many, many angels. This is very unusual for Anglo-Saxon England. Also on the cross down here is almost certainly an image of Pope Gregory. It's Pope Gregory with the spirit speaking into his ear. You see it a lot in late antique and early medieval iconography. And the art historians who look at this, they tell me this shows that this cross was about the dissemination of the Christian message. It had a very, very, very detailed theological content. And the peasant who lived in my longhouse, they wouldn't have understood that detailed theological content. So there was one message for the educated priests. There was another message perhaps about the crucifixion for ordinary people. So there are many, many messages. I don't know this, but art historians do. So I work with art historians and they can tell me how it is. People who work with text, they can do the same. And the really good answer is the work done by Mark Leone with people in North America, because he would not have known that that was very significant if he didn't work through oral tradition with the communities, black communities in Annapolis in North America. So it must be a multidisciplinary project. But I think that, excuse me, I think I wanted to talk about this because I wanted to understand why we don't talk about this. Why don't we talk about ritual and the way belief structures everyday life? And I think there are two reasons. One is new archaeology, I think, was deeply, deeply against any kind of spiritual or ritual belief. They talked a lot about structure, they talked a lot about systems, they talked a lot about the environment, but not what people thought, because what people thought was determined by the environment in which they lived, so really wasn't very important. But then also in post-processual archaeology, which said it was interested in belief, it really didn't talk about belief at all, because it wasn't really very interested in knowing that people's actions in the past were influenced, in this case, by Christianity. the intellectual tradition, the postmodern tradition in which they worked, they were not interested in knowing that Christianity structured everyday life. So we may not like it, Christianity, but that's how it was. That's how it was then. And so for those two reasons, I think that archaeologists in England have not engaged with belief. And one of the emerging things in England now is to try and understand how people believed, what they actually believed. And to do that, we must use the text, we must use oral history, we must use art history, everything to try and get to that. So it's multidisciplinary, but not necessarily new. Landscape. I wanted to mention landscape because one could argue that, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. One could argue that our attitude to landscape has changed very significantly since the early modern period. And we've developed a much more functional attitude to landscape studies. I could argue, in fact, that this is a product of the Reformation, a product of the emergence of science, a product of the emergence of the early modern world. But we know, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon world, that the landscape was deeply, deeply meaningful, with the barrows distributed throughout the landscape, either for good or for evil. We know there were sacred springs, sacred wells. We know the landscape was immensely meaningful. But yet, when we do landscape studies, landscape surveys, field surveys, we don't talk about that at all. But we know it was there. But to get to it, I think we need to use some very sophisticated cartographic GIS reconstructive techniques, but also a new mentality which thinks about the ritual, about the supernatural, about the marvelous and the power of the supernatural in everyday life. So I think some of our attitudes to landscape are a product of the early modern world, of the world that we live in. And this may be true of archaeology more generally. So I hope that's an answer.
Yes, my question is if it's possible to see a difference, for example, in the ritual perception of everyday life between people who live in the city and people who live in the country, so like a social difference in the ritual approach to everyday life.
Okay, I think the first thing to say is that we should look in both. And we should expect to find similarities and differences. So, in early medieval cities, okay, again, in early medieval cities in England, no one ever talks about the fact that at Hamwick in Southampton, there are many burials in the settlement, and the burials are quite extraordinary. But no one talks about the influence of those burials on the structure of the settlement. So there are burials there. The settlement is constructed around the relationship with the burials, but no one talks about that. So that's the first little point. In the city, one might expect, the argument would be that one would expect Christianity, for example, perhaps to be more prevalent in cities than in the countryside. One would expect there to be a deeper hold of traditional beliefs in the countryside. This is an argument that's put forward by some people who've talked about it. In fact, another English, I've forgotten his name, another English archaeologist has argued, in fact, that one should see exactly that one should see Christianity more in the countryside, more in the cities, and traditional practices more in the countryside. So you should see ancient practices being continued in the countryside rather than in the cities. Perhaps it isn't so simple as that. I think Christianity made amazing impacts in the countryside of England as well, as, for example, with the barrows, where you see the barrows being transformed into diabolical places rather than good places. So the influence of Christianity in the countryside was clearly there. But he argues that, in fact, in the countryside, you should see more traditional practices continuing. As I said, quite whether that's a real difference or not, I don't know. But I think the point is that we have to look for that difference rather than just assume that life in the countryside is all about production and about subsistence, and that life in the cities is about ritual and consumption, because people in the countryside were clearly had beliefs as well, but we need to look out for what they are. Is that?
And again, there, well, we have just talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering what more material evidence there might be that we could look for. Because, as I was telling you before, I'm used to look for rituals in archaeology, and because of Mesoamerican archaeology, because in Mesoamerican archaeology, ritual is a fundamental part of how you look at things. But for Middle Age archaeology, I wonder which ones might be the material evidence to look for ritual, because you were talking about settlement patterns, about burials, but I'm wondering whether in domestic archaeology we might look for something else apart from the burials that we were mentioning and maybe the ritual deposits. But I don't know, the way of the special distribution of activities, or maybe the food people might consume, it might be related or not. Could we look at something like this?
I think that one can find, if one looks, and the crucial thing is to look, one could find evidence for the ritual, evidence for the supernatural in all aspects of everyday life. I think one of the problems we've had in the past is that we separate off areas of life that we think are associated with ritual and areas which aren't. And so, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon case I talked about, people were happy to accept that burials were associated with ritual, but they weren't very, very happy to accept that settlements would also be structured by ritual. So I think we have to assume that ritual and belief structured every aspect of life, including subsistence, including consumption of food, including preparation of food, including where food was consumed. Lewis Binford has been very heavily criticized by many archaeologists, both for what he thought and also for the way he wrote. He wrote appallingly bad English, but he was also criticized for what he said. But one thing he did say that was very, very useful was that Binford said you should look for the ambiguity. Look for what's different. And he said what you do, and in fact I think he was talking about activity area research. He said you take your pattern, look where everything fits, and then focus on where it doesn't fit. Look for the piece where you have ambiguity, where you have difference. He says, there you must direct your attention. So Helena Hamerow, she took all the sunken featured buildings in England, she looked at them and she saw the bits that didn't fit. She saw the pattern that was different, and the pattern that was different was the placing of these special deposits of animals and humans in the upper layers, the termination deposits of the building. So look for the ambiguity. So in terms of food, one could look, as you said, both for where normal food is prepared. Are there any areas where special foods are prepared? Does this make a difference? I'll give you one example. The site at Yevering, there's been some recent work done on the site at Yevering on exactly the idea of activity areas. Where is food being produced? Now, what they found were a series of hollows, working hollows, in which individuals would kneel down or sit down to prepare animals. They were chopping up animal bones. And in the initial excavation report, Brian Hope Taylor, a brilliant archaeologist, Brian Hope Taylor said this was the butchery yard. This is where they butchered the cattle to consume them. People went back and looked at the animal bones in detail and saw this is not butchery waste. This is specialized destruction of the animal. There's something special going on here. Then they went back to the letter from Pope Gregory to Bishop Mellitus, who accompanied Paulinus as a missionary to the Anglo-Saxons. And in this letter that Pope Gregory wrote to the Anglo-Saxons, he says, do not destroy their temples. Do not destroy the temples in which they worship. He says, asperse their temples with holy water. And, he says, do not destroy the idols that they have in their temples, and convert the temples to Christian use. Okay? Then, he says, they have a custom of sacrificing oxen to the gods. Allow this custom to continue, but allow it to continue in association with a feast. And strangely, in one of the buildings at Yevering, you have a series of small wooden huts built next to the building, and associated with that hut are deposits of ox skulls. So the context is one where Brian Hope Taylor argued this is butchery. The wider context is a more detailed study of the archaeology showing specialized use of these animal bones, consulting the texts which tell us that the Anglo-Saxons sacrificed oxen to the gods, and Pope Gregory telling them to allow this to continue, but the sacrifice now is to the Christ rather than to the gods. So if you put all the context together, you can understand that what they were doing in those hollows was not butchery for consumption, but was the sacrifice of animals for the kind of supernatural purposes that Pope Gregory is talking about. So it goes back to the first question in many ways. You have to use all of the evidence, look for the ambiguity, use all the evidence, and then you can get to the ritual and belief that they had.
It's just ideas and try to come out. But I don't know, try to look at, for instance, the food that might be consumed in ritual places like monasteries, or try to look for differences, because there should be differences, but maybe there are not.
Yeah, I think here again, Binford again is useful in the sense that you take the general context and look for the ambiguity, and perhaps in this case the general context is provided by what we would expect them to eat, and what we really find. So if, according to the rule of St. Benedict, they're supposed to eat or not eat something, and we find it, then we find either that they're maintaining the belief, the ideology, or they're not. And I think it's as important to understand when they're not maintaining their belief systems as when they are. At San Vincenzo, I know you worked at San Vincenzo. At San Vincenzo, many years ago, Helen Patterson, I think, was working on the difference in consumption patterns between the monastery itself and the peasant villages which surrounded it. And I think that at that time, Helen, many years ago, concluded that in the monastery there was the possibility that they were consuming a lot more individual portions of food, a lot more roasted food, and the ceramics suggested that you had a much more individualized consumption, whereas in the villages they just had big pots for stews, so that everyone could eat together. And one could generate from that an ideology, two different ideologies, which is a more community-based, communitarian ideology among the peasantry, and perhaps a more individualistic ideology among the monks. So this may have changed now, but this was many years ago. But I think it is possible to compare what one would expect with what is really there, to see to what extent ideologies are actually being lived in the everyday. Because sometimes they didn't live the ideology in the everyday. You find animals that you wouldn't expect. Okay. They were not so strict with diet. And again, we had a student in Sheffield who was looking at early Jewish communities in the medieval period in England, and found that strangely that the prohibition on pork wasn't so rigorously adhered to as you might expect. So although they shouldn't have eaten pork, they did. And it's important to know that as well, because we know that people made choices. They choose not to go with the belief system that they were brought up with, and that's very important.